Something massive just shifted in Washington. And most Americans have no idea it happened. The Pentagon didn't hold a press conference, there was no primetime announcement, but behind closed doors, inside the corridors of the National Security Council and the upper floors of the Defense Department, a decision has been made. A strategic repositioning so significant that it could reshape the entire Middle East, redraw the lines of American power projection, and pull the United States into a confrontation that most military planners have quietly feared for decades. We're talking about Iran. Not the Iran of diplomatic back channels and nuclear deal negotiations. Not the Iran that Washington talks about in carefully managed press releases. The real Iran, a nation of 88 million people, a hardened military apparatus forged through 40 years of sanctions and asymmetric warfare, a regional power that has methodically built proxy networks stretching from Baghdad to Beirut, from Damascus to Sana'a. And America's new military strategy against it is not what you think. This isn't about missiles and airstrikes. This is about dominance architecture. Who controls the Persian Gulf's choke points, who commands the narrative, who wins the financial and ideological war that runs quietly underneath every visible military movement. Because here's what the mainstream media refuses to connect for you. The strategy against Iran is inseparable from the dollar's survival, Israel's long-term security doctrine, and the fracturing of the old post-W2 global order. These threads are woven together so tightly that you cannot understand one without understanding all of them. So let's pull back the curtain, carefully, honestly, and without the propaganda, and look at exactly what America is building, why it's being built right now, and what it will cost every single one of us. Let me start by giving you the foundation, the why behind all of this, because nothing happening right now with Iran makes sense unless you understand the historical architecture that built this moment. For decades, American foreign policy in the Middle East has operated on a simple but ruthless logic: control the oil, control the region, control the world. That was Henry Kissinger's grand design back in the 1970s, and it was cemented into the bones of American strategy through the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth would be priced in US dollars. And that single arrangement, that quiet, almost invisible financial architecture, became the invisible spine of American global dominance, not American military power alone, not American culture or democracy or any of the idealistic things politicians love to talk about on television. It was the dollar, it was always the dollar, and Iran sits at the very center of the threat to that arrangement. Think about where Iran is located on a map. It controls the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. It sits directly adjacent to the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of all the world's traded oil passes every single day. 20%. If that strait closes, even for a week, the global economy doesn't slow down. It seizes. Oil prices explode, supply chains collapse, and the countries that depend most heavily on that flow, Japan, South Korea, India, and yes, Europe, they all feel it immediately. That is Iran's greatest leverage, and Tehran has understood this leverage for a very long time. So when you hear Washington talking about Iran's nuclear program as the central issue, I want you to understand something clearly. The nuclear question is real, yes, but it is also a frame, a publicly acceptable narrative that allows policymakers to talk about Iran without ever having to explain the deeper economic and strategic competition underneath. Because the moment you start explaining that this is fundamentally about oil flows, dollar dominance, and regional power architecture, the story becomes far more complicated than most television anchors are equipped to explain or willing to. Now here is where the new American military strategy enters the picture, and this is where things get genuinely serious. What has shifted in Washington is not simply a change in tone or rhetoric, it is a structural recalibration of how America intends to manage the Iranian threat. And it reflects a much deeper acknowledgement inside the defense establishment that the old playbook is no longer working. The old playbook relied on a combination of economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, covert operations, and the implicit threat of military force. For years, this kept Iran off balance. Sanctions crippled the Iranian economy. The currency collapsed. Ordinary Iranians suffered enormously. And yet, and this is the part that genuinely frustrated American planners, Iran did not break. It did not collapse. It did not produce a popular uprising that swept away the Islamic Republic and replaced it with a government friendly to Washington. None of that happened. Instead, Iran adapted. It built a shadow economy. It developed workarounds for sanctions through trade with Russia, China, and smaller nations willing to buy Iranian oil at a discount in exchange for quiet political and economic relationships. It deepened its relationships across the region, not through traditional diplomacy but through the construction of what analysts call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias across Iraq. These aren't just armed groups that happen to receive Iranian support. They are nodes in a deliberately constructed strategic network designed to give Iran the ability to project power and threaten American interests far beyond its own borders without ever having to fire a single missile from Iranian soil. That asymmetric architecture, that network of proxy forces and regional leverage, is precisely what has forced American military planners back to the drawing board. Because here is the problem that every serious strategist in Washington now understands. A conventional military strike on Iran, even a massive, well-coordinated one targeting nuclear facilities and military infrastructure, would not solve the problem. It might set back Iran's nuclear timeline by a few years, but it would immediately activate that entire proxy network. It would turn the Persian Gulf into a war zone. It would almost certainly result in the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, at least temporarily. Oil prices would spike to levels that would send shockwaves through an already fragile American economy, and Iran, rather than being defeated, would emerge from the rubble of such a strike as a martyr nation, with far greater public support internally and far greater sympathy from Russia, China, and the global South than it has today. In other words, the military option that sounds simple and decisive on paper is, in reality, a potential catastrophe. So what is the new strategy? What has actually changed from everything that serious analysts, not television commentators, but people who actually study these systems carefully, are observing? The new American military strategy against Iran operates on 3 simultaneous tracks, and each one is more consequential than it appears on the surface. The first track is what you might call integrated deterrence. This is a concept that has been formalized inside the Pentagon over the past few years, and it represents a genuine evolution in American military thinking. Rather than relying on the threat of a single overwhelming military strike, integrated deterrence means weaving together conventional military power, cyber capabilities, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and intelligence operations into a seamless, continuous pressure campaign. The idea is to impose costs on Iran constantly, not through one dramatic confrontation, but through an unrelenting series of smaller actions that, taken together, degrade Iran's capacity and confidence over time. You've seen glimpses of this already: cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, assassinations of key Iranian scientists and military commanders, covert support for opposition movements inside Iran. These are not random events, they are components of a coordinated strategy. The second track is the reshaping of regional alliances, and this is arguably the most significant development that most Americans are not paying nearly enough attention to. The Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, were not primarily a peace initiative in the traditional sense. They were a strategic realignment designed to build a regional coalition capable of containing Iran without requiring constant direct American involvement. Saudi Arabia is the critical piece here. A full Saudi-Israeli normalization, which Washington has been actively pushing, would effectively create a united front of American-aligned Middle Eastern powers stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. And that coalition, once solidified, fundamentally changes the strategic calculus for Tehran. It means Iran would no longer be able to play Arab states against Israel or exploit regional divisions the way it has for decades. The walls close in, not just militarily, but politically and economically. But here is the complication that Washington keeps running into. Saudi Arabia is not simply a compliant American ally anymore. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has demonstrated repeatedly and deliberately that he is willing to deal with China, maintain a relationship with Russia, and pursue Saudi interests even when they conflict directly with American preferences. The Saudi decision to join BRICS, the economic bloc led by China and Russia, sent a message to Washington that cannot be misread. The old assumption that Gulf states will automatically follow the American lead because they depend on American security guarantees is no longer reliable. That dependency is loosening, and that complicates the regional alliance strategy enormously. The third track is the most dangerous one, and it is the one that serious military analysts are watching most carefully right now. It involves the question of Israel and the degree to which American strategy has become entangled, perhaps irrevocably, with Israeli strategic objectives in a way that could pull the United States into a direct military confrontation with Iran that Washington did not choose and does not fully control. Here is the reality that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud, but that everyone in the defense establishment understands. Israel has its own timeline, its own threat calculus, and its own willingness to use military force against Iran that does not always align with American preferences or American strategic interests. Israel views a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat. Full stop, not a manageable threat, not a containable threat, an existential one. And that means Israeli decision-making around Iran operates with a sense of urgency and a tolerance for risk that goes far beyond what Washington is comfortable with. When Israel struck Iranian territory directly in 2024, a genuinely historic escalation, it demonstrated that the threshold for Israeli military action against Iran has dropped dramatically. And every time that threshold drops, the risk of a broader regional war that pulls in American forces increases. The uncomfortable truth is that American military assets in the region, aircraft carriers, fighter squadrons, missile defense systems, are positioned in ways that make them both a deterrent against Iranian retaliation and simultaneously a potential tripwire. If Israel strikes Iran and Iran retaliates against American forces, Washington is suddenly in a war it did not formally choose to start. That scenario, a war that begins not through deliberate American decision-making but through the logic of entanglement, is the nightmare that keeps serious strategists awake at night. And all of this is happening against a backdrop that makes the strategic environment even more volatile than it might otherwise be. Because the global order itself is fracturing. The unipolar world that America dominated after the fall of the Soviet Union, the world where American military power and the dollar's reserve currency status gave Washington almost unlimited capacity to shape events, that world is coming apart at the seams. Russia's war in Ukraine, whatever you think of its justification or its conduct, has accelerated the formation of a parallel international order anchored around China and Russia and increasingly attractive to nations across the global south that have grown deeply resentful of what they see as American economic coercion and double standards. The sanctions against Russia did not isolate Russia. They accelerated the construction of alternative financial systems designed specifically to root around American financial dominance. And Iran is watching all of this with intense interest because every new system that reduces the dollar's reach reduces the effectiveness of the primary weapon America has used against Tehran for decades. Iran has already begun settling energy trades in currencies other than the dollar. It has deepened its economic relationship with China to a degree that would have seemed unimaginable 20 years ago. A 25-year cooperation agreement between Iran and China, signed in 2021, involves hundreds of billions of dollars in Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure in exchange for discounted Iranian oil. That agreement effectively gives Iran a lifeline that sanctions alone cannot sever, as long as China chooses to honor it. And China, which views Iran as a critical piece of its own strategic architecture in the Middle East, has strong incentives to do exactly that. This is why the American military strategy against Iran cannot be understood simply as a military question. It is embedded in a much larger struggle over the future of the global economic and political order. The real contest is about whether the American-led system, the dollar system, the Western alliance structure, the network of institutions and norms that Washington built after World War II, can survive the challenge being mounted against it by a coalition of powers that have decided, for varying reasons, that they are no longer willing to operate within the rules Washington sets. Iran is not a superpower, let's be clear about that. Its military, despite significant improvements, cannot match American conventional power in a direct confrontation. But Iran doesn't need to match American power directly. It needs only to raise the cost of American action high enough and complicate the strategic environment sufficiently to deter Washington from taking decisive action. And in that more limited objective, Iran has been remarkably successful. The American public needs to understand something that gets lost in the noise of daily news cycles and political theater. The decisions being made right now about Iran, in Pentagon briefing rooms, in National Security Council meetings, in quiet conversations between American and Israeli officials, these decisions carry consequences that extend far beyond the Middle East. A significant military confrontation with Iran would send oil prices soaring at a moment when American consumers are already stretched thin. It would strain alliances with European partners who depend on Middle Eastern energy stability. It would hand China and Russia an enormous propaganda victory and likely push even more nations toward the emerging alternative international order. And it would cost American lives. Real people, not abstractions. in a conflict whose ultimate objectives and exit conditions remain deeply unclear. The men and women making these strategic decisions are not stupid. Many of them understand these risks perfectly well, but they are operating within a system that has its own logic, its own institutional pressures, its own momentum. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about in 1961 is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural reality, a network of defense contractors, think tanks, lobbyists, and political relationships that creates powerful incentives for continued military engagement, regardless of whether that engagement actually serves the national interest. And that system shapes the strategic choices available to decision makers in ways that are rarely visible to the American public. What you are watching unfold with Iran is not simply a foreign policy story. It is a story about the limits of American power in a world that is changing faster than American institutions are capable of adapting to. It is a story about the tension between maintaining a global empire and attending to the genuine needs of ordinary American citizens. And it is a story about the choices that get made when the people making them are insulated from the consequences. The question that every American ought to be asking right now is not simply whether America can win a military confrontation with Iran. The more important question is what winning would actually look like, what it would cost, and whether the people sending others to fight and die in the Persian Gulf have thought honestly and seriously about the answers. Because history is very clear on one thing. Empires that overextend themselves, that pursue military dominance beyond their actual strategic and economic capacity, do not decline gradually and peacefully. They collapse in ways that are sudden, chaotic, and deeply painful for the ordinary people caught inside them. And right now, America is standing at exactly that kind of crossroads, with Iran as the immediate flashpoint, but the entire future of American power and American prosperity hanging in the balance.